I stood up and backed away from the edge. I hated heights. I was stopped by a wall that shouldn't have been there. I turned around and was met with a terrifying sight. The cave was gone. I was face to face with a solid stone wall, the site of whatever mountain this was. I had to keep telling myself I was still in the NoEnd House. I didn't leave. Clearly this isn't an actual mountain, but it felt so real. I turned back and looked over the cliff again. There was no way. This house has been pretty messed up before now. I was outside for God's sake, but what it expected me to do now was just too much. I knew what those rocks down there meant. That was the entrance to room 5. There was no stairs leading down, no other paths to use. I was trapped again. The house wanted me to jump. The house wanted me to jump. I sank to the ground and curled into a ball. I couldn't do it. There was no way I could jump off a cliff onto a jagged rock formation 100 feet below. My mind was split in two. I knew that I was still inside, but my surroundings screamed in my ear the opposite. I stayed there on the wooden ground for a while. At that point I had lost all concept of time. After what seemed like weeks, I finally stood up. Slowly I made my way to the edge of the cliff and looked down. The giant 5 taunted me to jump. It knew I couldn't do it, and it taunted me. And then the hum returned. The low and distant hum. It seemed to come from behind me, resonating within the mountain. I don't know what came over me, but after hearing that sound, something inside me lit up. I clenched my eyes shut, and I jumped. The wind was rushing up as I fell, and a deep fear washed over me. I was going to die. I was going to smash into those rocks and die. They were going to tear me apart, and I was going to die. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just fell, even with the loud wind around me. The hum was now deafening. I just wanted it to be over. I just wanted it to be over. I just wanted to hit the rocks, and I wanted it to be over. And then I stopped. I wasn't falling anymore, but I never hit the rocks. I opened my eyes and looked around. I was standing on the familiar wood paneling of the house. The hum was gone, and silence took its place. I had made it. I was in room 5. I don't know how it happened, but I was in room 5. The feeling of dread was gone. I was just incredibly happy to be alive. After a few moments to collect myself, I decided to look around at the rest of the room. My happiness left me fast. This room was empty. The walls matched the floor, and the ceiling matched the walls, and the walls had no doors or windows. I was in a sealed box. Then I realized I didn't make it. I wasn't safe. I had made it out to the 4th room, but only to enter room 5, and there was no leaving it. At that moment, I wondered if David had been in this room. I wondered if he had jumped off that 100-foot cliff and ended up stuck in the room. And if he did, that means he got out. He wasn't there. I was alone. He got out, and I would too. The thought of David escaping this room gave me newfound confidence, and a second wind filled my spirit. I was going to get out of this room, find David, and get us the hell out of here. I walked around the perimeter of the wall and felt for any sort of inconsistencies. Nothing. The walls were flawless, barely a scratch on them, let alone some secret exit. I started to knock at random places on the walls. They were completely solid. The confidence started to leave me. I was running out of ideas, and that's when she spoke to me. Maggie, you shouldn't have come here, Maggie. I nearly jumped out of my skin if that was possible. I was still facing the wall, and the voice had come from the middle of the room. The voice was that of a little girl. At least that's what it sounded like. I turned around slowly, and my eyes fell on who spoke to me. I was right, a little blonde girl, no more than 7 years old, with light blue eyes and a long white dress. She smiled at me and spoke again. But now that you're here, let's play a game. There was something horrifying about that little girl. She wasn't scary like those horror girls are in those Japanese movies. She looked completely normal. If I saw her walking down the street, I would have just walked right on by. But looking into her eyes, I felt complete terror. Jumping off of a cliff was scary, but I wouldn't jump off 20 cliffs twice as high if it meant I could take back 1 minute of looking into her soulless eyes. After a moment of staring, I finally spoke. What game? Who are you? I mumbled. If you lose, you die. If I win, he dies. My heart sank somewhere below my feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I knew she was telling the truth. Which will it be? She smiled. Neither. I don't know where I found the courage to talk back to this demon child, but I had come too far to just let David die, and if I died, this was all for nothing. No, I chose neither. But then I saw it. The reason the little girl terrified me. She was more than just a small child. Looking at her, I also saw what appeared to be a large man, covered in hair, with the head of a ram. It was a horrible sight. I couldn't see one without seeing the other. The little girl stood in front of me, but I knew her true form. It was the worst sight I had ever seen. Too bad. And with that she was gone. I was alone again, in an empty and silent room. Only this time something was added. A small table where she stood appeared from nowhere, as though it was there the whole time. There was something on it, but I couldn't tell from where it was. I walked up to the table and looked at the small object. It was a small razor, like what you would find in an X-Acto knife. I reached out to pick it up, and as I did, a scream left my mouth. When my hand came into view, I saw something that was never there before. It looked as though something was branded into my skin. A single number 6. I looked back to the razor and noticed the tag attached to it. To Maggie from management. I thought you may need this. After reading the note, I started sobbing uncontrollably. Tears were rushing down my face harder than they ever have in my life. I had never cried like that, and I don't think I ever will again. I fell to the ground and sunk my head into the hardwood floor. I was sobbing for hours, just lying there on the ground. And then the crying stopped and depression set in. I don't even know why I was crying. It wasn't about David. It wasn't even about how I was stuck here. There were still no doors in this room. I was still trapped, but that's not why I was sad. I was in the deepest depression possible, complete and emotionless depression. I felt empty and clawed my way up from the ground and steadied myself against the table. My eyes fell on the razor, and I picked it up. I was going to kill myself. I couldn't handle it anymore. I had had it. David was probably dead. I was trapped in here. It was over. I pressed the razor against my wrist. right above the 6 that had appeared on my skin. The sobbing came back, and I just stood there, crying with the razor pressed against my wrist. David was dead. I was about to die. Nothing mattered anymore, and with one deep cut, I sliced down my wrist. Immediately after slicing down my wrist, I was no longer in room 5. I didn't die. I knew that for sure. The depression was gone, but I was by no means happy. Tears were still finding their way down my face. The room I was in was similar to the previous one, and again it had no doors. There wasn't any lamps, but somehow I was still able to see everything clearly. The room was completely empty, but before I had time to think of what to do next, it went dark, and the hum from before returned. I covered my ears in protest. It was louder than it ever was, but it was over in a moment, and the lights returned. Only this time something was added to the room, and then I screamed. There, in the middle of the room, strung up by chains and naked from the waist up, was David. It looked like he was tortured. Knife wounds littered his chest and arms. "David!" I ran up to him as fast as I could. He was conscious. I saw his chest move up and down, but he wasn't speaking. And that's when I noticed what was etched into his chest. I dropped to my knees as I saw it. The 7 stared at me as though it had eyes. I heard David try and speak, and I got to my feet and got as close as I could to him. "David! David, can you hear me?" "Maggie, what are you doing here?" His voice was slight, but he was talking, and I was thankful for that. "David, I'm trying to save you. How do I get you down?" There were large padlocks on the chains holding him in place. I looked around the room for any sort of key, but all I found was a small knife in one of the corners. The metal was way too thick for that knife to even dent it, so I disregarded it as useless. I went back to David. It looked like he was on the verge of death, and then I felt my pocket vibrate. It startled me something awful. I took the phone out of my pocket. As I suspected, one unread text. I flipped open the phone. That isn't me. I don't know what to think. David was right there in front of me, but that text was from the first number that contacted me. It was the first text I received from David that mentioned the NoEnd House. "Maggie." I heard his voice clearly with my ears and my mind. It seemed like his voice was coming from all sides. "Maggie, you have to go on." "What are you talking about? How?" I was face to face with David, or whoever it was that was chained up. "That knife." He made a slight movement of his head toward the corner. "Go get it." I ran and was immediately back with the knife clenched in hand within a few seconds. I had no idea what was going on, but I needed to save him and would do anything. "Now stab me in the chest." "What?" I was shocked. David hung there, staring directly into my eyes. "You have to run that knife through the 7 on my chest. It's the only way to save us both." "No!" I stumbled backward. "No! You're not making any sense."